talking about Torah spirituality, there's a certain problem. It's a common problem when you're dealing with a concept which applies sort of in different cultures, and when you want to translate the language and you want to talk about someone in a culture that's not English speaking, and you're using the English language, so do the best that you can. And often you pick a word that is probably better than any other word, but still it has nuances and implications that aren't really accurate in the other culture. And the word spirituality suffers from this greatly because there are many different religions or religious type traditions, and many of them have features, and the features that they have overlap with each other in certain ways and are different in certain ways, and for lack of a better word, we use the word spirituality for all of them. And that covers over a great many important differences. So I have to start by telling you that when I'm talking about tonight, Torah spirituality or Jewish spirituality, it's a concept which may not agree in its chief features with the spirituality of other religious traditions. And I'm apologizing for that because we don't have any better word. But the Torah concept has three pillars, three fundamental dimensions that it rests on. Oh, thank you very much. The Torah concept has three features that it rests on, and these won't overlap with the idea of spirituality in other cultures. One, of which there's considerable overlap, is that spirituality consists in part of a certain type of consciousness, certain type of conscious experience. That's not all that it is, but it does contain a certain type of conscious experience. And that conscious experience has elements that are common to other religious traditions. The second pillar is that it's universal. It's not an activity among activities. It's not a time among times or a place among places. It is continuous, and it applies to every aspect of life. And that, I think, is rare, if not even unique, to the Jewish tradition, where the universality is literal and all-encompassing without any exception whatsoever. I think in other traditions you'll have a wider or narrower scope of what they will call spiritual, but in terms of the subject matter to which spirituality applies, in the Jewish tradition there's no exclusion at all. That's the second feature. And the third feature is that Jewish spirituality is the relationship with a reality. It is not just a description of an inner private experience. And in this, it may part company with every other culture's definition of spirituality. And that means that we are going to be using the word in a way that's unique for us. No matter what the quality of your inner experience is, from the point of view of the Jewish tradition, it might not be spiritual at all. If it isn't a relationship with an external reality, which exists in and of itself, has its own essence and its own being, and indeed, that external reality is what dictates the kinds of relationships with it that count as spiritual. So let's start with these three ideas, these three pillars, and look at them one by one. And of course, each one is going to be treated superficially. Yes, we could spend the whole year talking about aspects of this idea, but this is an introduction to the idea. So let's talk about some features of the quality of experience that we call spiritual. Well, first of all, any quality of experience starts with the condition of the subject that's having the experience. What's the content of the experience for the subject having the experience? There is an identity, and the experience is an event that happens to that identity. What is the self-conception that's part of that experience? One crucial element is that there's no such thing as isolation. There's no such thing as isolation. I'm just mentioning this as a kind of touchstone. I'm not going into the details, but there was a whole discussion of the place of the conscience in Judaism. Is there such a thing as having your own standards and judging yourself by your own standards and praising or condemning yourself when you live up to your own standards and so forth and so on? That's a long, complicated, and difficult discussion. There's one feature in the structure of the discussion that is profoundly wrong from a Jewish point of view. And that is that the idea of a conscience is that I stand before the bar of my conscience, and it's in expressing my conscience that my self-worth is determined, whether I've done well or poorly and so forth and so on. From the Jewish point of view, the smallest number of anything involving a human being is 2. There's no 1. There's 2 and more, because you can't cut the Creator out. So if you're there, there's at least 2. So the idea that I have standards of my own, and I measure myself by my own standards, which for certain schools of psychology is the definition of maturity and health. Just shows you how prejudiced their definitions are. And the same with sociology. A guilt culture as opposed to a shame culture. The idea of standing as an isolated individual, the whole of the political theory, how do you make groups out of individuals? You make them by free agreements, where the individual starts and freely agrees to relate to another person in some way, so he starts as 1. And the 2 is artificial. No, the 2 is essential. There is no 1. Finding yourself as 1 is just to overlook the essential reality. So a key element in Jewish spirituality is being conscious of the Creator. That means being conscious of yourself as a creature. The deepest definition that you have of yourself is that you are something that's given its existence by a Creator. So that consciousness is a key element of Jewish spiritual consciousness. Then, like the Mesilas Yesharim says at the very beginning, the fundamental starting point is for a person to know ma chovaso ba'olamo. What is my obligation in my world? Now, not every social philosophy or religious philosophy would start that way. What is my obligation in my world? You're much more familiar with a thought process that starts with, what are my rights? Don't get in my way. Don't tell me what to do. Don't push me around. That's where I start from. The Jewish starting point is very different from that. is what are my obligations? Not that someone can push me around, but what are my obligations? And the Mesilas Yesharim answers this question in a very fundamental way. It is, well, God created the world as a proving ground in which, through one's behavior, one can earn eternal life in the world to come. So, my obligation is to live in the world so as to be able to get to the world to come. In other words, encapsulated in that short paragraph is a profound philosophy. My obligation is dictated by what the Creator wants. What the Creator wants is where obligation comes from. So now I know that what He wants, that's my obligation. So that becomes my project. Now that's chapter 1. Chapter 18, the Ramchal raises a very subtle question, which when you put it together with chapter 1, gives you a whole philosophy. That's what I heard from Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg of Ner Yisrael. I heard it on a tape many years ago. In chapter 18, he asks, what is my motivation for acting? What moves me? What am I trying to accomplish when I act? And the first thing to notice is, what we said before isn't the answer to that question. There's a big difference between what is my obligation versus why do I fulfill my obligations? What motivates me to do what I'm obligated to do? You can have a dozen people, all of whom have and recognize the same obligations, but the motivation for fulfilling the obligations is very different. Let's say pay your taxes. There are many people who recognize an obligation to pay taxes. Some pay because it's the law. Some pay because it will benefit the public good. Some pay because they don't want to go to jail. Some pay because they want to have a good reputation. There are many different motivations for fulfilling your obligation. The mere fact that it's an obligation doesn't dictate why you're fulfilling your obligation. Here, Ramchal says that the highest level is to want to please the Creator. So that's why I ask, why did He create the world? And I thereby derive what my obligation is, since He created the world for me to go to the world to come, so therefore it's my obligation to do that. My reason for doing it is because I want to please Him. So there's a double consciousness here. Number one, there are objective standards which apply to me and define success and failure in the things that I do. And then there's what I regard as the most precious thing I can do. Notice how I put it. I didn't say the most precious thing in the world. What's the most precious thing that I can do? What's the best thing I can do? And the best thing I can do is I can please my Creator. And that means I do that by fulfilling the obligation that He set before me. So, the Ramchal says in chapter 1, as you go through life, everything that you meet, you measure. How will this get me to the world to come? This object, this resource, this action, this attitude, this belief, this commitment, how will that get me to the world to come? Because that's my obligation to get there, because the Creator is created for that purpose, and my desire is to please Him. Now, a person who has this in mind when he sits down to eat, or when he gets a check in the mail, or when someone asks him for charity, that is a key element of a spiritual consciousness. Another key element, and I put this first because I think this is less mentioned. What I'm going to say now is very widely recognized. Another key element is, if I'm a creature, then my existence and my ability to function are a gift. And that means, as a person who appreciates what it means to receive a free gift, that creates in me a sense of gratitude, a sense of indebtedness, a sense of feeling as if I matter. If the Creator is investing in me, then I must have something worth investing in. There must be something that I'm capable of that's worthy of His investment. So it's not just, I got something good and I should say thank you, which is true, but it's much bigger than that. Because since he created me for a purpose, his giving me life is an investment in my fulfilling that purpose. And then that becomes a sense of gratitude, which graduates into obligation to do that which he's providing me with the means to be able to do. These are elements of Jewish consciousness. Now, I want to skip to the third of objectivity and then come back to universality for a moment. I would say every culture that has anything that's worth calling spirituality describes certain elements of consciousness. But there's a big parting of the ways. You may have heard of the psychologist Viktor Frankl, who was a Jew, who was in the concentration camps, the Second World War. He created a school of therapy called logotherapy or existentialist therapy, which is based on the need for meaning. One of the fundamental human needs is the need for meaning, that what happens to you, what you're doing, should be meaningful. And he says that if what you're engaged in is meaningful to you, that will determine your ability to focus on it and to identify with it and to have your energies galvanized to make efforts for it and may contribute to your psychological health and even your physical health. And he gives two examples. He says he met someone in the concentration camps, in the Second World War, whose brother was imprisoned about 50 miles away in a different camp. And the one whom Frankl met told him, I believe that the strength and consistency that I show in bearing my suffering will enable my brother to survive. My brother 50 miles away, who won't know about it. That was one example of what he called meaning. And the second example, even more dramatic, there was a woman, Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist, so he was a physical doctor as well. And in the infirmary, there was a woman who was dying, and he reports that her last days were made more bearable by the dialogue that she had with the tree outside her window. Dialogue, not monologue. She talked to the tree, and the tree talked to her. Well, that's what she experienced. And that made her last days more bearable. Now, for Frankl, those are examples of genuine meaning. We look at that and we say, but it's subjective, it's not true. This brother's bearing the suffering is not going to increase the probability that his brother will survive. And this woman wasn't having a conversation with a tree. From the point of view of the psychologist, that doesn't matter. It's the belief that this is what's happening, which has the psychological effect of giving the person courage and giving the person consistency and bearing strain and pain in a more healthy way, and so forth and so on. From the point of view of the psychologist, it makes no difference whether this is true or not. Now, I read Man's Search for Meaning, which is his most famous book, 40 years ago or more. Because I'm a philosopher and I'm trained in logic, this occurred to me right away. And when I used to discuss it in my shiurim, I used to make this point. And I think this was 1990 or 1991. I had a student who told me that his mother noticed this in Viktor Frankl's book and met him and asked him about it. That the examples of meaning that you're giving are inner experiences which are fantasies, and they aren't true. And he said, you're right, I'm a psychologist. I'm recording what kinds of experiences people have and what effect they have on their ability to function. And I'm reporting that an experience of this kind has a positive effect, but that's all that I'm doing. Well, from a Jewish point of view, that would not be called spirituality. As vivid as it is, and as healing as it is, and as focusing and empowering and granting a person courage and all the rest, that's not spiritual, because it's only a fantasy. Now, I want to point out something to you, which I think Frankel doesn't mention, and but I think it's a very important, how shall I say, feature of the way the description works. In order for that brother to be strengthened by his contribution to the survival of his brother, he's got to believe that's real. He can't say, let's see, what fantasy should I meditate on that will help me be stronger and more successful and perhaps survive? I know. Here's a fantasy. It isn't true, but I'll pretend that what I do helps my brother. And then, since I'm pretending that'll be meaningful for me. And then I'll be strengthened and I'll be more courageous and maybe I'll survive. So when I'm under stress, I'll just think about this fantasy that I'm helping my brother, knowing that I'm not. That's not going to work. For it to be a meaning, even psychologists agrees to this, for it to be a meaning for the person who's meditating, that person has to believe it's real. It may not be real, but he's got to believe it's real. So what is it that's doing it for the person? What's doing it is his belief that it's having an effect on the real world. Jewish spirituality is the consciousness of having an effect on the real world, not just on meditating on something that's inspiring. You imagine that you make up a fantasy hero and you meditate on the courage of that fantasy hero and you're inspired. That might happen, but that's not, from a Jewish point of view, real meaning. That's just fantasy. That's a dream. You know, when you wake up from a dream, what do you say? Oh, it wasn't real. That's right. That's right, it wasn't real. That makes all the difference. It was only a dream. So from the Jewish point of view, there has to be, it's not only that you have to feel that it's real, it has to be real. And in order for you to verify that it's real, it has to be verified by some kind of objective criteria. We have a tradition that's from the point of view of early sources of the Jewish people, is 3,800 years old, and of course it goes back originally to the creation. And in that tradition, we have many, many accounts of experiences that people had with objective verification of those experiences as being connected to the real world. It isn't just that they had vivid experiences or dreams. Abraham has an experience of negotiating with God for the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and the next day he observes the public ruin of those cities. That's not just a dream. He has an experience of God promising him children, and after passing the physical boundaries of childbearing, both he and his wife, they have a child, and that child is public knowledge. The whole of the community reacts and interacts with this child, so it's not just a dream. So he has, over and over again, he has a war, a consortium of 4 kings completes a successful military sweep of the whole area, and in one night he defeats the whole of them and takes all of the spoils. So Abraham has public confirmation for the experience that he has. That's how he knows that these things are not just inner experiences, they're experiences of something real. We can graft onto that tradition. I mean, the Jewish people, when they left Egypt, had it in spades, many, many public experiences which they recorded as a whole nation. And then you have the whole period of the First Temple period with continuous miracles and all the rest. And we have a tradition of what kind of experiences are available and what effect that they have on people. When we also stand in that line, in that tradition, and we participate in those experiences, we have all of that objective background in addition to things that may happen to individuals as well in our times. But we have that whole background that gives us the the confidence that we are really interacting with a reality that's external to ourselves. So that element is part of the Jewish definition of spirituality. And then the third key element is its universality. Many religions divide up life into the parts of life to which religion applies and the parts of life to which religion doesn't apply. There is a famous religion that has, this religion has hundreds of different ways of being practiced, but in some of them there's a famous quote, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and render unto God what is God's." The whole world divides into that which belongs to the temporal power and that which belongs to the deity, and your life it divides up, and you have to know how to divide things and put them in the right box. That would not be an expression of the concept that we are talking about. The concept we are talking about is to have what you might call a religious attitude all the time. All the time. We are famous for having a blessing to make after you come out of the bathroom. And although in the bathroom there are certain things you shouldn't meditate on, but your consciousness that you're a creature, and your consciousness that the Creator is guiding you in whatever you do, that consciousness never leaves you under any condition whatsoever. So, what accompanies you, Shivisi Hashem Neregdi Summit, which is the way the Ashkenazi version of the Shulchan Aruch starts, it's a quote of a verse which the Rambam quotes in his Guide of the Perplexed. I've placed Hashem before me continuously, meaning my consciousness of God's presence is with me continuously. And as the Rambam says, you know very well that if you were in a throne room with the king sitting on the throne, your behavior would be very strongly affected by where you are, and you would behave there quite differently from the way you would behave in the street or in the privacy of your own home. And if you are conscious of God's presence everywhere and everywhen, then you're going to behave always as if you were in the throne room with the king, which is exactly what the Rambam prescribes. So that means there are no trivial activities. There are no neutral activities. There are no activities which are, give it or take it. It doesn't matter. You might as well be doing something else. Even if there are alternatives for what you do, how you do what you do will give it that religious quality. So that, if I would try to make a slogan out of it, religious experience is both a verb and an adverb. It's a verb in and of itself when you are praying to God, when you're studying His Torah, when you're celebrating a holiday, you're doing an explicit mitzvah. So then it may be that the subject of the experience is a religious experience. But then there's the adverb of how you do everything else. So, for example, the blessing you make in the morning, which is applied to Torah study, commands us lasok b'divrei Torah, to be occupied with the words of Torah. Now let's imagine Ruvain runs a business, and he has investments of 7 figures from various places, and he has industries and so forth and so on, and he's negotiating a contract. And he's reading over what the other side wants him to sign, and he says to himself, now wait a second, this clause in the contract, our civil law doesn't allow it because it's really misrepresenting the service, and we're not allowed to do that. Let me call the rabbi and check, because I remember learning something about that in the Choshen Mishpat. So, in order to sign this contract, to obligate myself to the service that the business relationship requires, I have to check the religious sources to see whether the Creator of the universe allows such a signature or not. So that means I conduct my business as religious activity. I'm not unconscious of that. At all points, I'm asking myself, well, people decide what profession to learn. Often, they don't take into account the moral challenges of a particular profession. Different professions have very different moral challenges. If you become a dentist, probably the moral challenges that you face will be minimal. If you become an accountant, or you become a lawyer, you may face many. Your employer, the CEO, says, put that expense on next year's expenses, not this year. But, sir, it's only November. Don't write it down till January. Why? Because our tax structure needs it that way. Oh, really? But it's a lie. We incurred the expense in November, not in January. Write it my way. Okay, so what are you going to do? Write it his way? Or not write it his way? Lawyers also. Sometimes lawyers are asked to put things in contracts and put them in such a way that the other side won't notice them. And later, the CEO can pull it out and say, you signed this? $2 million on the table. You signed it. You didn't notice it? Your business is to read contracts. Now, I'm a lawyer, and I know people miss this sort of thing because it's put in a funny place. I happen to know the law that is put here is binding also. A lot of people don't know that. Should I put it there? Does Jewish law allow me to do something which could mislead somebody else and cause him a loss? Even if he's a business competitor or whatever? So, being a lawyer, being an accountant can put you under terrific moral pressure, which being a dentist wouldn't. Now, you have to know yourself. Can you take the moral pressure? Maybe there's a religious principle by which it would tell you, be a dentist and don't be a lawyer or an accountant. You say, but that's my way of earning a living. What's religion got to do with that? It might have a lot to do with that. There's a food plan. And for people in your intersectional bracket, there's a 30% discount. Oh, how nice. 30% discount. What are they selling? Is it healthful food? Are they good advertisers? Are you likely to have your healthful diet undermined by joining this food plan? And so forth and so on. Your consciousness of wanting to serve God invests in everything that you do. It's something that's there, as I say, either as the verb or as the adverb, and that's part of what makes it Jewish spirituality. If there's at any point where you say, well, Jewish spirituality doesn't enter in here, you've lost it. You've lost the essence of what Jewish spirituality is. Nothing is immune from that touch. So, for example, we define service of God as 24/7, 365. There's no limitation, no particular environment, temporal or spatial, to which service of God is limited. How is that possible? You spend all your day praying, all your day studying the holy text. When do you do anything else? And the answer is very simple. Ramchal says this word for word in the Derech Hashem. The Rambam expresses the same idea in Hilchos Deos. This is the way the Ramchal puts it. Service of God consists of two different things. Mitzvos, where he told you, these are the things I want you to do. And providing yourself with the ability to do those mitzvos, which may mean money, it may mean rest and recreation, it may mean sleep, it may mean good diet, it may mean living in a different city. There are all sorts of things that may be necessary in order to be able to do the mitzvos that Kodesh Baruch Hu tells you to do. Now, doing the mitzvos and providing the means are all service of God, all of it. And a well-organized life won't have anything else in it. You have in it the mitzvahs that you have to do, and you have in it making yourself capable of doing those mitzvahs, which, when you learn it broadly enough, includes rest and recreation, includes a certain amount of leisure time, it includes some physical pleasure. All of the things are part of the means that you have for doing the mitzvahs. But that's the way you conceive of them. You don't say, we're coming out of Purim, and inevitably in this yeshiva, We have some students who say, well, that just shows how realistic Judaism is. Once a year, you're allowed to get plowed. Really plowed, really, really knocked out. Okay, it's once a year, but still, at least Judaism recognizes that what? That getting drunk is an important part of life? No, it does not. It recognizes that under certain conditions, the Creator might want you to be drunk. We'll talk about that in great detail before we come to Purim, whether that's correct or not. Ashkenazim, Sephardim, the whole story. But it's not the being drunk, it's the spiritual accomplishment in the condition of being inebriated. That's the goal. If you lose sight of the spiritual consciousness and just say, Judaism is realistic because it allows me to get plowed, you've lost it. That's not a Jewish spiritual consciousness at all. So, this is something which accompanies the Jew continuously. Now, I happen to be writing a book about the Rambam. The Rambam puts this in extremely dramatic terms. I'm going to mention it because, for one thing, people don't associate this with the Rambam because they're not aware of it. Let me start with the textual observation the Rambam makes. We say Shema. So the first paragraph of the Shema talks about loving Hashem and training your children and tefillin and mezuzahs, that sort of thing. The second paragraph starts with loving Hashem, and then it says la'avdo, to serve Him. So it's quite interesting. The word to serve Him doesn't appear in the first paragraph at all. And the second paragraph, and love is paramount in the first paragraph. Second paragraph says la'ava u'la'avdo, to love Him and to serve Him. Well, that means there must be some service that comes after love. There's a certain kind of service which has to be preceded by love, and only then the service can be done. There are other types of service which could be independent of love. Also, this doesn't exhaust the whole thing, but somewhere there's something for which love is a prerequisite. So, in the Guide of the Perplexed, the Rambam's great philosophical work, he puts it this way. You have a mitzvah to know God and a mitzvah to love God. Those mitzvahs are intertwined because you can only know what you love. You can only love what you know. You can't love an unknown. And the more you know about HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the more you know Him, the more you will love Him. Okay. So now you have knowledge and love. Knowledge and love brings you to a joy in learning His Torah and doing His mitzvos. That joy brings you to a conscious focus on HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is what I described 20 minutes ago, a conscious experience of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that's the service. The service is being consciously connected to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We have a word for that in modern Jewish thought. It's dveikus, being attached to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The word dveikus goes back to the book of Genesis. Al ken yazav ish es aviv es imo v'dovak b'ishto v'hoyu l'basar echad. Therefore, a person should abandon his father and mother. A man should abandon his father and mother and cleave to his wife. They shall be one flesh. And some Mepharshim say, the reason why that verse is addressed to a man and not to a woman, because you don't have to tell her. She knows that being attached to her husband is the primary attachment that she has to have. But a man might miss it. So he needs to be told that explicitly. Abandon your father and your mother and attach yourself. So that's dovek. V'dovak b'ishto. That's an illustration of dveikus. In a healthy marriage, there's a conscious focus of each one on the other, a conscious mutual experience that they share. And that's the relationship that you're supposed to be developed with respect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that's the service. That's the highest service of spirituality. That's the highest level of spirituality a human being can attain. And this, he says, was the level of Abraham, the level of Moses, the level of the great prophets. And the greatest success, he says, is to maintain that connection in all walks of life, in everything else that you're doing. It's good, he says, to isolate yourself so that you can train yourself in it when there are no distractions. And the Rambam, the great philosopher, the great logician, says one of the most precious periods of the day, now, you fill in the blank, the Rambam, the philosopher, one of the precious periods of the day, are the moments that you have on your couch at night before you fall asleep, where you can meditate on Kadosh Baruch Hu without interruption because the day is over. If it's 10 a.m. or 1 p.m., what are you going to do at 3 o'clock and at 5 o'clock? And you're preparing and you're thinking, what will I say? What will he say? And how shall we negotiate? Or, shall I buy it or shall I not buy it? When you get to the end of the day, you relax and let yourself go. Tomorrow's another day. Those precious moments on your couch, when you can meditate on HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that's the highest service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, for which knowledge of Hashem and love of Hashem and joy are prerequisites. So anybody who thinks that the Rambam is a philosopher and his understanding of serving God is simply knowing the philosophy is dead wrong. It's wrong. Dare I say that the Rambam was a Hasidic Jew? Yeah, I do dare say it. Dveikus, who talks about Dveikus? And the truth is, who doesn't talk about Dveikus? If you look carefully, it's in all the Sfarim. But here's the Rambam on record. So this is this conscious connection with the Kadosh Baruch Hu, which follows you in your relationship with the Kadosh Baruch Hu. That's something which is Jewish spirituality, and that's what we would have described by the word spirituality as applied to our tradition. As you can hear, it's not going to be the same as it is for many other traditions. Now,
the question: how do you meditate on HaKadosh Baruch Hu?
How do you meditate? This is very interesting. Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan wrote 2 books on meditation. One, he explained how it plays a role in what it means to become a prophet. The other was writing about prayer and other similar things. I can't describe the regimen, how you get to it, but there is a way of focusing your mind. And here too, there are 2 different things to take into account. One is to focus your mind so as to block out everything else except what you're focusing on. And the other is, what are you focusing on? If you look at the laws in the Shulchan Aruch for prayer, they sound like a mystical or meditative experience. You sort of lose track of where you are. You lose track of the surroundings. There's only one thing that occupies your mind. Now, if you've had a brush with Eastern traditions, you undoubtedly have met the idea that the goal of meditation is to empty your mind altogether. There should be nothing there. It should just be a mind with a focus and nothing in the focus. Sort of like going out to an all black night sky and focusing the lens on your camera. Right? But there's nothing there to take but black. Right? You won't be able to know from the picture whether it was focused or not, because it's just all black. So, and they have all reasons for that. They feel that the intellect is the enemy, and if it provides with the content, you're not in touch with what's ultimately real. They have a whole long story about that. We reject that story completely. Completely. A good time to meditate is when you're saying the words of the Shema. You're meditating on the existence of a creator who's responsible for running the whole world. Focus on that. That's a content. But focus on that to the exclusion of any other competing content. Now, same thing is true with standing before HaKadosh Baruch Hu in prayer. The essence of prayer is knowing that you're standing before the Creator and communicating with Him. That's what the Briskers reading the Rambam call the Hefts of prayer. That's what prayer is. Then there's what's the prayer about. Okay, it's important to pay attention to the words and know what they mean and to have those things in mind. But if you lose track of the fact that you're standing for Kodesh Baruch Hu, it's just not prayer. It's just, it's off track altogether. If you forget some of the words or misunderstand some of the words, so it's not as focused a prayer as it otherwise could be. But the chefetz is having that consciousness. So again, it's that interpersonal consciousness of that reality. So, in building Jewish spirituality, what you want to do is to build all three dimensions to the extent that you can. And I have two recommendations for how to build them. And you should ask other people because this is just my experience. One is to be in the company of people who have it. I spent thousands of hours with my Rabbi Zatzal, and I saw it in him endless times, how he did a mitzvah, how he prayed, how he danced on Simchas Torah, how he cried on Tisha B'Av, and I saw him do this in the presence of 2 people, 20 people, 200 people, and 2,000 people. It made absolutely no difference. Absolutely no difference. So no, he wasn't doing it for the audience. He was just doing it, just serving the Kodesh Baruch Hu. If you wanted to be present and share with him, fine. If you didn't, also fine. He was serving the Kodesh Baruch Hu. So, to be in the presence of such people, and also to read biographies of such people. Biographies give you a kind of key to a vicarious experience of what this person went through. And when you read, you see things that definitely, that definitely have an effect on what you think is possible, and what kind of spirit is available for some people, and then you hope to imitate it to some extent, and hope that the Kodesh Baruch Hu will share it with you that way, to some extent. I know with my Rebbe Zatzal, someone invited him to something, and there were those who felt he shouldn't go. The person who invited him wasn't worthy of it, they felt, and so forth and so on. And I saw them tell the Rebbe he shouldn't go. I saw it. And he listened. And then, when they were absent, he went. He didn't fight with them, didn't argue with them. They said what they said. And he listened, respectfully. And then he did what he felt was right. And that was all there was to it. He's bigger than having the argument, and bigger than being overwhelmed by their opposition. He did what he did. I saw him once being attacked by someone in public, vociferously. I was so shocked. I couldn't take it. I pushed myself in between the two of them and faced the other fellow and pushed him out the door. I came back inside. I was shaking. And the Rebbe was very calm. And I said to him, how could you stay calm under a provocation like that? And he said, I know what's going on at home. And I thought, oh, he knows this guy has trouble at home. And since he has trouble at home, that's why he's behaving that way. So I saw things like that. Hold on a second. I think this is my Rebbe call.